Thank you, for joining this webinar. We are going to be talking to you about financial efficiency today. So, for those of you who don't know me, I'm Sam Henson, Director of Policy and Communications at the National Governance Association, and I'm presenting this webinar alongside Charlotte. Charlotte, do you want to introduce yourself?
Thanks, Sam. Hello, everybody. I'm Charlotte Harding, Director of Professional Development.
Brilliant. So we are very much aiming to keep the webinar within the confines of about half an hour, slightly over possibly. But yeah, this is very much a quick whistle-stop tour really on financial efficiency. But I'll hand over to Charlotte, who's just going to give a little bit of an overview of the session.
Thanks, Sam. As some of you may well know from previous sessions, our webinars are 30 to 40 minutes, but we are going to try and keep it closer to the 30 than the 40. They are in a sort of lecture away really, rather than a seminar or a networking opportunity. So we won't be monitoring or answering questions in the chat. Everybody here is muted, but you will be sent all of the slides and the recording afterwards. So if there is anything particular that comes out of today that you do want answered, and if you have gold membership, you can always remember to contact the gold line either through telephone or by email. But starting off with a big thank you really for the work that you do, particularly under the challenging circumstances that we're going to talk about today. But we'll start with a quick poll, if that's okay, just to see who's in the room. So if you can drop your answer there. This is to sort of reassure everybody here really that everything that we're talking about today is relevant to all settings. So whether you govern at a sort of a small primary maintained or a nursery school or a really large multi-academy trust, everything that we're talking about today will be relevant to you. Okay, lovely. So we've got a really good split actually, which is wonderful to see. So yeah, just to reiterate that everything that you're seeing here today, all of the resources that we've got available will fit and suit all of the settings in which you govern.
Brilliant. Thanks, Charlotte. Wonderful. So we're just going to anchor, if you like, the start of this conversation in what we know to be the context that we are operating out of as the wider governance community. Hopefully many of you will be aware that NGA do an annual governance survey, and in 2023 what that showed us was that balancing the budget, financial pressures remains the top challenge that boards report to us, and that's been the case since we've asked that question really since 2018, and it's steadily becoming more and more prominent. So more of you put that down this year than before. We also had much more information given to us this time on the reasons behind that, so I'll go into that in a few moments. But yeah, if you haven't seen our survey results, you can get them on our website, and that goes into more details. But what it did show is 76% of people who responded were NGA members. The rest weren't. So that shows you that this isn't skewed to our membership alone, but we are seeing more and more people saying that finance is the biggest challenge they face. So can I have the next slide, please, Charlotte? Thank you. So again, this is from the survey results, and as well as the short-term financial challenges, we also look at the long-term and also just to generally try and get a feel for how governors and trustees are feeling about the financial prospects that their organisation is facing, and we saw another marked increase from last year from those who were saying that the current levels of funding are unsustainable. And as you can see here, only a fifth of schools and trusts reported to us that they felt financially stable within those current levels of funding. Those governing within trusts were more likely to report that their medium to long-term position was slightly more positive. That's a trend we've seen for a while. But that said, they were still very much in the same boat of saying the long-term picture, whether we had enough money to deliver what we want to deliver. Very much, you know, the focus of our vision as an organisation. The majority of people saying no. We don't. So I was just going to do a very quick poll, just take a quick temperature check here. So if we could launch that, and if you could just put down the one that most reflects your situation. So in the medium to long term, are you financially sustainable as you are? You're financially sustainable, but only with savings and drawing on reserves, or you're not financially sustainable without significant changes. So we'll just give that 2 minutes. 2 moments, and have a look at the outcome of that. So there you can see the number of you saying you are financially sustainable as you are without any kind of dependency on reserves or significant changes is minimal. And I think that's a real kind of sign of the times. Worryingly, you know, there's actually more people falling into that third option as well than perhaps we've seen in the past, which indicates the real nature of the problems. But we're not going to dwell on that for too much, because what we want to do with this webinar is very much talk about, right, so what do we do now? So Charlotte, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you. I think we're sort of seeing this bit of a perfect storm really at the moment, sort of contributing to real financial challenges. We are, of course, all aware of the decline in that real-time funding over what is now a really considerable period of time. Of course, you know, down to the huge underfunding of the school system as a whole. But there are other contributing factors that have been sort of more relevant more recently. We are seeing falling roles, particularly, of course, in the primary phase at the moment. But actually, that's going to have a considerable long-term knock-on effect to secondary school planning in the coming years. Of course, you know, inflation remains high. The energy costs, and of course, you know, sort of those challenges that started in 2022 are continuing. There's no sign of them abating, and actually continuing well into next year and probably beyond. And actually that cost of living crisis affects everything, doesn't it? Every aspect of things that you buy, whether it's supplies or food or services, never mind, obviously, you know, sort of employer salaries and costing of staff. But the biggest burden that we're seeing on schools when it comes to finances is the wider support that you're providing to the community. The increase in behavioural issues, the increases in exclusions, the increases in safeguarding concerns, and the expectation that the school system is picking up community support, all provide a considerable financial burden. So all things that I'm sure you're seeing in your schools and trusts. Sam just touched on this, but I think it goes, well, it should go without saying that boards shouldn't set a vision and strategy that isn't financially achievable. But this balance is something that's very difficult to achieve. And I mean, we've got this in our own trust at the moment. What we want to achieve and what we can afford to achieve are sometimes too difficult, sometimes two different things. We want to obviously focus on children and young people's outcomes, not just academically, but, you know, we want our children supported in school so they become happy, productive members of society. And of course, that's, you know, the heart of everything that we do in governance. but the usual funding streams sometimes do not support the vision and strategy that we set. And then, of course, it's our responsibility as a board to ensure that your school or trust has a sensible strategy to find that shortfall, or, of course, to reduce expenditure. And then we have to go on to monitor the implementation of that strategy, which we will be coming on to next. We don't want to spend too long lamenting the position at the moment. It is what it is. We are where we are, and there doesn't seem to be any potential changes that are coming up at the moment. And we've got to be practical, we've got to be positive, and we have to explore how we can work with the resources that we have. What we'll now do is we'll look at how staff and governors can be honest about how we look at our financial position, how we monitor it, how we consider risk. We'll look at generating income and responsibilities and roles around that and how that can be helpful, and some ideas and tricks in reducing expenditure. We'll talk a little bit about integrated curriculum financial planning as well, and how hopefully all of these things can come together to provide you with a really useful way to take back to your boards in how you can support. Sam.
Great, thanks, Charlotte. So I think it's quite good to start this conversation in terms of what can we do next from the perspective of just asking ourselves, our boards, a series of questions which we've listed here, and I think these are really important questions. First of all, starting off with what does our board look like? Does it have what it needs? But also our staff. You know, do we have the right skills and the right level of expertise, both within the staffing, but also within the board as well. I think we have to be quite careful with that, because what we're not saying is that you recruit somebody with financial expertise to the board and they do everything. But what we are saying is that actually having that awareness of how finances work generally at a certain level can be really helpful. But it is the board's collective responsibility. The way your organisation is funded, what you do with that money is something that obviously is a collective responsibility. So we can't go too far into leaning onto one or two individuals. So that's when I think having a focus on the right level of training, effective induction. So when I joined my trust and I joined the finance committee, one of the most effective things for me was actually having a one-to-one conversation with our chief financial officer. And you know, that was invaluable, and so it might be, if you haven't had a chance to do that, it's certainly worthwhile having a look at that. I think actually from an individual perspective, asking yourself, are you confident when you go to board meetings in terms of contributing to financial decisions? If not, why not? And you can perhaps address that through training or just having those conversations. Are you also confident in your CFO or your school business manager? Are you confident in the service level agreements you've got in place? Are you confident in the way, if you're part of a trust, that money is coordinated together by the trust board, by the executive team? You know, is there a gag pooling approach, or is there very much we leave schools to their own devices? So I think the first thing is actually understanding how funding allocation works within your organisation if you're part of a trust. I think that's important. And just on that, if you are a maintained school or a SAT that is thinking about joining a multi-academy trust, that's just one to be aware of, that you know, things can change going forwards, and actually some trusts will take very different approaches to others. But anyway, we don't have time to go into that now. Next slide, please, Charlotte. So this is just a flag with you. There are a number of places that I think in relation to those things about delivering confidence for you as an individual and your role in this to go and have a look at. The specific training available that we obviously deliver, but also a host of materials on our website. So do have a look at that. But more widely, if you're a maintained school, often your local authority will be coordinating some level of training and some level of support with that. If you're part of a trust, again, the trust itself may well do a form of training, should be doing that, and beyond that, obviously having a look at the likes of NGA's Learning Link is a really good place to start. The guidance and advice available to you, I think, is one thing, and these are just two examples. But then there's also the need to look more widely, looking at what the national narrative is, but also what the rules are. So again, looking at things like the school's financial values standard, but and if you're part of a trust or if you're a trust board, becoming aware and familiar with the Academies Trust handbook is absolutely vital. So that's just a few things there. Charlotte, over to you.
Thanks, Sam. So a few words on benchmarking. This website is DFE managed, but actually what it does is allow schools and trusts to compare your settings against others. And it is often criticised because the data is historical, and it is true that it usually represents the previous year, either academically or financially. But as a benchmark, it can be extremely useful. I would absolutely encourage you to compare your schools, whether it is a single maintained school, sorry, or whether you're part of a small or large trust. You can look at schools within your trust, within your geographical area, or those with similar characteristics. So if you're working or governing in a small nursery or a PRU or a special school, all of these things can you can sort of feed into this tool, if you like. So it does give you a really good opportunity to look at it. Of course, there is context around all of this data. And when you use this and analyse it, there may be some very good reasons why your spend, for instance, is considerably higher than the school down the road. But what it does is allow you to ask questions, and that's the important part. It creates possibly some really healthy debate about how your school and trust are spending their resources, and it gives you an awareness of how and where other people spend their money and how it compares to you. So for those of you that haven't seen this website before, there's just a couple of screen grabs here to give you an idea of what this information analyses. So it looks at reserves, it looks at what you've sort of got in the bank, if you like. It looks at overall spending. It looks at income and expenditure, and it also allows you to break this down further with things like staffing costs. Again, not just teaching, but support staff. It looks at your energy spend and facilities management as well. So a really good opportunity for you to get a real good litmus test, if you like, of everything that's going on in your own sort of immediate area and also wider across the country. So one of the key things about, sort of making sure that you are really well equipped to manage your financial situation is honesty. And we need to be honest about where we are. So some further considerations for your board here. Are we being cautious in our budget setting, or are we being optimistic? Is it realistic? Both can mean further challenges, but if we're honest about where we are and where we set up for next year's budget, or are we already in a position where we're sort of setting ourselves up to fail because we're not asking the right questions and because we're not coming from a place of honesty and transparency, really? So do you as a board give yourself enough time to discuss finance? You know, this might be through a structure, which includes, you know, sort of finance or audit and risk committee. It might be that you work without a committee structure, but are you making sure that you've got a really strong agenda, which ensures that you've got the time allocated to discussion? Are you happy with the information that you receive? Is it in a format that you understand, not just how your finance staff and your senior leaders want to present it, but is it useful for you as a board? Does it give you the information that you need to question? Do we act quickly enough? So do we wait for the next set of accounts or the next finance meeting, or are we brave enough to have those courageous conversations and ask what we need to do? So it's not just asking questions, but it's about what we're doing next. Do we probe further, and are we brave in those conversations? Sam.
Great, thanks, Charlotte. So I think before we go any further, it's important we distinguish between maintained schools and academies. Organisation is key for financial management, clearly, but obviously you can only do the right things at the right time if you know what is expected of you, and there are differences, as you can see here. If you've been governing in one setting, so again, perhaps you know, if you've been governing in a maintained school and you know, you are used to a certain way of doing things, if your school is in the process or in the future looks at joining a trust, that will change. So that's one thing to be aware of. Trusts work to a September to August accounting year, so that's a key difference. But for maintained schools and their timelines, I think this is where your governance professional or clerk really can support you, and also getting your business manager to your meetings as well, I think is a really key thing. It's interesting, not there's quite a lot of variation of practice in terms of that, and I think some boards are really good at making sure either their business manager or CFO is there at the meetings. Others don't have that on an ongoing basis, and I appreciate you know, a school business manager can mean very different things in different places. So that's just the one to be aware of. Are you always hearing the financial things from the same person? Is it from the head, for example? Are you getting a different view? So I think that's quite an important question to ask. So get familiar with the timelines. On the next slide, we've got the stuff for trusts as well. So I'm not going to go into the details of both of these slides, but depending on where you are, I think get familiar with them, and also that point I made, if you are or at any point in the future, if you are joining a trust, just be aware that things will work differently and the timelines are different. So if we could go to next slide, please, Charlotte. Thank you. So I just want to spend a few moments talking about risk. Risk is something that we need to talk more about. We all have to live with risk, regardless of what type of organization you are. Financial risks will always be one of the biggest areas to focus on. It's often about identifying and mitigating against it rather than removing it altogether. But having a strong risk register is clearly something that is really important, and it's actually mandatory for trusts as well. So effective risk management, I think, is something that we need to become more familiar with as governing boards more generally. And some of you will probably be thinking, well, you're not telling me anything new here, we do this. But actually it's surprising that, you know, again, the level of varying practice in terms of how we approach risk is very much something that can look different for different trusts, for different schools. So we'll come back to that in a few moments' time. I think, Charlotte, you're next, are you?
Thank you. And we wanted to include some thoughts on income generation, which we absolutely appreciate is never easy. So it's, of course, not written that boards have responsibility for income generation. But of course, you know, we're here to support as much as challenge. And whilst we may not you know, sort of be out there with collection boxes, we can help our school leaders to ensure that all ideas for revenue generation are explored. Some schools very much sort of shy away from this and see it as turning education into a business. And, you know, that we're only ever worried about the bottom line. But considering the first few slides that we've talked about here and the challenges that face really all schools and trusts, we have to be a bit more practical and a bit more proactive about recognising how and where we can bring in additional income. So, I mean, the fact that we can look at increased admissions and, you know, your PAN, etc., it is obvious, of course, but, you know, the sort of things that sit behind that. Have we got an attractive offer? Do we promote our schools? Have we got the space and capacity to support more children? Do we have a site that can be used outside of school hours? And of course, this all, you know, may need some investment, which may seem counterintuitive, but it doesn't always have to incur huge expense. You know, can we rent our space out? Are there local businesses that can support and work for us? Income generation isn't really just about looking at cash into the coffers. Sometimes it's about saving money by other, you know, sort of using other types of resources and time. And, you know, we need to be sensible with staffing, don't we? You know, do we look at our structure regularly? Does it serve our needs? Does it grow with us as we grow? Do we need that really experienced teacher, or do we have the opportunity to train and develop our own staff through NQTs, ECTs? Do you make the most of your expertise? And, you know, can we market and knowledge and areas of specialism as a school and trust externally to other people within the sector? And, you know, we absolutely acknowledge that this is not easy and actually not available or viable to all schools, but it is absolutely worth a conversation, and at least ask the questions of your leaders. We've got a lot of skills and experience in our boards, haven't we? You know, those people around that table. How can we support to make sure that this is something that is at least discussed? There's a couple of screenshots here from some grant websites that I would recommend at least just having a look at. It can be an absolute minefield. I appreciate it. Resources. These three websites particularly are really helpful. They don't need huge amounts of time. You haven't always got to write really complex bids. And you don't need necessarily to have to think about grants as thousands and thousands of pounds. There is pots of money out there, but finding them is absolutely the challenge. Whether you're a maintained school or a trust, you know, your local authority is often a really good information pool, really, and a great source of knowledge about these little pots of funding that might be available. And, you know, it does take time, but again, working with your local businesses might be a really good starting point. A lot of organisations have charitable objectives to contribute to the community, and you might find that some of these businesses and organisations can absolutely contribute to the workings of your school and trust. Sam.
Great, thanks, Charlotte. So obviously I was talking about risk before, and Charlotte's talked about income generation. But I think income generation has to be leveled against and go hand in hand with reducing expenditure. So I just really want to very quickly come back to risk for a second, because I think this is all very much linked, and risk really needs to be looked at as making sure the organisation's assets are used to support and carry out the purpose of the organisation, if you like. So there's this huge role in ensuring that you as the governing board are avoiding the organisation's assets becoming exposed to unnecessary risk, and that includes reputational damage, but also going for the opportunities as well. We're not talking about being risk averse. We're talking about looking at risk and opportunity together. But a risk is really anything that, if it happened, could affect your organisation from achieving its purposes. So income generation and reducing expenditure, it might seem obvious that one is clearly opportunity, one is mitigating against risks, but even in reducing expenditure, I think there are levels of opportunity that can come with that. It might be, in looking at reducing expenditure and doing something differently, you come across a much more efficient, effective way of doing things that therefore becomes the long-standing practice going forwards. And it's often out of those times of thinking, oh, we've got to mitigate against a pressure here, that you can discover and you can move into a new way of doing things that really contributes to that lasting approach of your organization. So I think there's a number of things, specifically in terms of reducing expenditure, that we might look at in terms of the current context and the need to mitigate, but also all of these provides perhaps a level of opportunity that are worth exploring, even if you are not yet at the point where you need to look at these from the perspective of we need to tackle these now because we've got a hole in our finances. It might be that you're doing not too bad, but you want to look at these areas anyway because they bring that level of opportunity. Energy efficiency, obviously, last year didn't really seem like this was much of an option for anyone. It's still one of our biggest spends, but do we have a strategy and approach? What can be done? Have we looked at the different suppliers? Have we put this into our financial sustainability efficiency strategy, if you like? If not, absolutely something that can and should be done. Going paperless for staff, for example, might look at that purely because the cost of paper has gone up, but also what does that mean? That might mean that we can then look at reducing level of contracts for things like photocopiers and that those sorts of things can cost an awful lot. But then that is then linked to, well, how are we going to do things differently? How are we evolving our curriculum, reviewing technology? And if we're using technology more, we can do things differently there. That means we don't perhaps need the same level of resources over there. Clearly, there's a bit of give and take here because you're then going to need to invest in the technology itself. But I think reviewing technology on an ongoing basis is really important because we tend to think of that as that's an area we've got to keep investing in. Yes, but there might be ways of doing things that have been done for a very long time that we can trim down, and we can look at doing that differently. So for example, where the trust where I govern, we've gone with a approach which basically means all of our staff and all of our pupils have iPads. Now, I know what you're thinking, that's a huge expense, and it is, and I'm not suggesting everyone could do that, but what that does mean is we can reduce costs elsewhere. So a bit of give and take. Reviewing things like SLAs, really, really important. But also, I think the one that I really want to draw attention to here is collaboration. Collaboration can be such an effective way of reducing expenditure, but also establishing those long-term ways of working differently that can really add weight to your efficiency as an organization. And that can take different forms. It could be that you're just working with a school down the road. It might be a partnership that you've already got. It might be two trusts working together. Just because you're in one multi-academy trust doesn't mean that you can't collaborate and work with other trusts, and we've seen some really good examples of that. you know, sharing of staffing, etc., really can lead to some really good savings, but also a much better way of working as well. Next slide, please, Charlotte. Great. So I'm just going to we're going to finish off shortly, but just quickly before we go, just to emphasize the role that integrated curriculum financial planning can have in all of this. ICFP sometimes is referred to optimization. I think the name of this kind of makes it sound more complicated than it is, because you often talk about this and people are like, what is that? Actually, is really just a case of linking your financial approach with your curriculum. But doing it in a more formalized way. It's not necessarily new, but it's putting an emphasis on that and looking at it very much in a holistic, strategic way, which can be really, really helpful. So it's designed to stimulate that informed discussion between financial planning and curriculum decisions, and it brings those decision makers together, both from the board perspective, but also from a staffing perspective. Are the two aligning? You know, are we worlds apart on our finance and curriculum, or are they actually harmonizing with each other? If not, what do we need to do to bring that together? And this directly goes back to one of the very first slides today, where we had our scales that Charlotte talked about, where we need to balance our vision and our available budget. In order to do that, we have to bring the two different sides together. You know, the learning of pupils and what the tools that they are being given to do that through the curriculum, you know, is that being serviced appropriately or not? And very much bringing those conversations together, which I know many of you will probably think, well, we do that, but there is also, because we have this very long-standing practice within school and trust governance of having different committees, which obviously is a good thing. It does mean that sometimes those conversations that are happening in a curriculum and standards committee, for example, become quite isolated and far removed from the conversations in the finance committee, and we're not bringing them together via the full board. There's ways around that. You know, we know that some trusts don't have individual, some schools and trusts don't have as many, or if any, individual committees other than the ones they have to have, like the audit committee for a trust. But actually, even if you have got that committee structure, I think it's just finding a way to bring it together, having those collective conversations as a whole, and making sure we're looking at our school or trust holistically and not isolating those conversations. And then finally, next slide, please, Charlotte. Just to flag up with you some of our resources that have most of these have been referenced as we've gone along, but there's other things as well, and you know, including our events and our training that you can have a look at. We've got a few kind of slides just highlighting some other things we're doing, which Charlotte will just flick through quickly. Our upcoming events, we've got a few leadership forums, some discussions coming up on the role of governing boards and exclusions, and that's really talking about the debate and whether the current role is right. But we're also going to talk about other things as well over the year. There's some membership details there for anyone who's joined who isn't a member, and just to flag up our induction guides as well. Oh, and Learning Link, can't not mention that, or Charlotte won't be happy, and training consultancy. So do have a look at those slides in your own time. But thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it. And yeah, I hope you have a good rest of the day.
Thank you.